I'm thrilled to welcome everybody here today, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and the Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And again, it's really lovely to welcome all of you here today. It's been a wacky term, adjusting to life online, and it looks like we will just get better and better at that next term. But I just wanted to remind you that this is our last Nickle at Noon of the season, but we will be back next month from January the 14th. These events are always free. You can register on Eventbrite, or you can reach out to Marla or myself for the codes. Marla, can I ask you, will the codes stay the same? She's looking into it. Okay.
Yes, I'm going to try to make it the same.
Okay. The full program will be on our website just as soon as I finish checking on getting all the details together, but it looks like it's going to be another dynamic program. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, where we post all of the talk information, or you could subscribe to our mailing list and get details delivered to your inbox once a week. Introductions. I'm Michelle Hardy. I'm the curator of one of the curators at Nickle Galleries and your host today. I'm wearing different hats today, and one of those hats is as the coordinator for Museum and Heritage Studies and the driver behind the Practicum, Museum and Heritage Studies Practicum program that I'll talk about in just a moment. And Marla Hallstad is our front-end manager and co-host on the Zoom call today. Marla, at this juncture, I just want to say thank you for all of your hard work and perseverance managing these Zoom calls every week and doing such a great job. Really couldn't have done it without you. We'll ask that you keep your microphones on mute until the end of the presentations, because there's only 3 speakers. We should have lots of time at the end for Q&A, so we certainly welcome your questions afterwards. And please be aware that we're recording this and adding the recording to the Nickle's YouTube channel. Participant names and chat will not be included in the recording. However, if you speak, your voice will be there on the recording. And for any students that have joined us today, do share that YouTube link, because it's great to see the kinds of projects that our students have been engaged in. So the program today is about Museum and Heritage Studies 533, the Practicum students. We had 3 brave students this term who, through no fault of their own, have had to engage with Practicum projects at a distance from the sites. The typical Practicum project is sort of a collections management, although the students do all sorts of different things, curatorship. I've had someone do development work, educational programming, all sorts of different things. But because of COVID and opening and closing different institutions, the 3 projects were negotiated at a distance. And just a reminder that the minor program in Museum and Heritage Studies is a wonderful program. It's been going for over 20 years. We have students, sort of alumni at institutions across Western Canada, especially across Alberta. It attracts students from across campus. I think the 3 students we have today are all history students. However, we've had students from science, from anthropology, from Latin American studies, Greek and Roman studies, all sorts of different students. And they have done very well with this program. So we have 3 wonderful students who are going to speak today. And I'll stop sharing my screen and welcome Laura Kirrick, who is a history major and who's been volunteering for the Calgary Sports Hall of Fame and Fort Calgary, and did her practicum at Fort Calgary, working with both Anna Rebus and Shannon Murray. So I'll stop sharing, and Laura, over to you.
All right, we'll scroll through here instead. So I will start off by introducing myself. My name's Laura, and like you heard, I'm a history major at the University of Calgary with a minor in Museum and Heritage Studies. And this course is actually the last of my undergraduate degree. And it was really awesome to end off my university career with an opportunity like this. So I was placed at Fort Calgary Interpretive Center for my practicum. For those of you who might not be familiar with it, it's a National Historic Site that is run by the Fort Calgary Preservation Society, and it enhances, preserves, protects, and promotes the significance of the site for both citizens and visitors to Calgary. And Fort Calgary was actually my first choice pick for practicum. I found that we talked about it a lot in multiple classes during my minor. We took quite a few field trips there, and everyone at the fort was always really engaging and willing to give us insider knowledge about what's going on there. So I was just excited to be part of that, and I'm really appreciative of their narrative that they're going forward with to be more inclusive to more communities. So I was glad that I got to play even a small part in that. So my role for my practicum, I was a researcher supporting one of their upcoming book projects. And I was pretty excited about this because through history, I have a lot of experience in research, so I know how to use primary, secondary sources, both digitally and physically. So I was excited to get more professional experience outside of just the classroom. So you probably want to know what my research topic was. So my main topic was to uncover the history of the Fort Calgary Interpretive Center. So not Fort Calgary in the late 1800s, but the history of the museum itself. So some of my subtopics within that was who spearheaded the project, building a little timeline of events from initial concept to the opening day, looking into how the RCMP were involved with the Interpretive Center, and just general challenges, successes, plans, and other people and groups involved. So I'll share with you just a few of my findings. The first one is that the idea to build the Fort Calgary Interpretive Center first came from the Alberta Historical Society in 1963, but the person that is credited for spearheading the project is the former Calgary Alderman John Eyre. And when this idea first came, the Fort Calgary site had been buried under warehouses and railroad tracks and a junkyard for about 40 years. So it took a lot of excavating and archaeologists to actually uncover where the site was under all that. And it actually took 15 years from initial inception to opening day. It was a long rocky road, and it mainly revolved around how the city was going to acquire the land because it was owned by the Canadian National Railway. And then another part that I found interesting is when I first started, I was told that there was a magazine or unknown source to the fort called the Fort Calgary Quarterly. And so I was tasked with finding what it was. And luckily I found it at the Central Library downtown. And it's a magazine that was ran for the first maybe 5 years of the fort, and just talked about the exhibits, who worked there, the programming, etc. And then a little interesting thing I found kind of for the last 2 points is that throughout my findings, there was just this general sense of apathy towards the project from all levels of citizens to government, just about finances, like, is it worth it? All that. And this kind of continued into books written about Calgary in general. I found a lot of books never talked about the museum, or any of the project, which was strange because I flipped through a lot of books that were celebrating Calgary, and I kind of thought that they would touch on the museum, but most of them did not. So on a lighter side, some more interesting facts that I want to share is that, first of all, as a way to gain funding when the project first started, the Fort Calgary, I'm not sure if it was a preservation society, it might have been the steering committee at this time, but they were selling off 1-inch squares of Fort Calgary land for $1. So everyday citizens could buy these, schools bought these. And similar to that, when the fort first opened, there was 100 pieces of wood from the original fort up for sale at $100 a piece. So I think it's kind of interesting to wonder how much of this was purchased and who has these things today. And then another interesting fact I found was that in 1979, the former fort curator Linda Wasnick, in a Calgary Herald article, she was quoted as saying that she had people calling up the fort to ask why it was there. And that just kind of links to that apathy I was talking about on the last page of people not being clear why the project was done in the first place, and just a lot of struggles to prove its existence, essentially. And then as a more fun fact, I just thought this was interesting. In the original design, the parking lot was supposed to be underground, and that was to hide the cars from ruining the prairie grass setting they were trying to mimic. And I drive by there a lot, so I just think it's kind of funny to look at it now and imagine what it could have looked like. So now onto my research in general. Of course, I had successes and struggles throughout all this. The first success I had is I coincidentally just started my research with the Calgary Herald Archives, and this allowed me to build a timeline of events, which as I moved on to other sources, I realized was super helpful in being able to pinpoint where different materials were actually utilized in this timeline. And then, of course, in all research, there's a lot of dead ends and just pointless things you come across that don't end up being useful. But in the end, I was able to put together quite a large collection. And you'll see here I listed a few things. You know, I have 89 newspaper articles, 15 files for the Fort Calgary Quarterly, 15 images, 10 books, and 16 assorted other sources. And then, of course, there's always struggles. So one of the things I struggled with is there was just very limited information available about the relationship of the Interpretive Center and the RCMP. And that was one of the things I was tasked with to research. So I found a little on my own and a little more by emailing with the local RCMP group. But in general, there's just not a lot of material out there. But that's kind of might be linked to my next point that the pandemic closed a lot of archives. So I never got to go to the Glenville Library and Archives or the City of Calgary Archives. But based on my emails with both of those and just what I could see online, they both have a good collection of materials. So hopefully whoever goes there next when they're open will have better luck with maybe the RCMP. So I'll finish up now by sharing what I've learned about museums in general and through my minor. So first, one thing I've learned is that museums are constantly evolving. And I think that before my minor, and for a lot of people, you just kind of think that museums are stagnant, because I know I can look back to when I'm a child and a lot of the museums I've gone to are still the same today. But in reality, I think just a lot of them are so underfunded that they can't change their exhibits as often as they'd like to. But if you look into the programming, the narratives they tell through tours or just general speaking with anyone who works there, you'll find out that a lot of people are quite honest about their exhibits being dated or the changes they'd like to make, but just can't. And through my research, I found that even with Fort Calgary, within the first 5 years of being open, they published a book called the Master Plan for Fort Calgary, which they used a bunch of community engagement surveys and made a lengthy list of suggestions to make the museum better. And that was within 5 years of opening. So I thought that was really interesting just to see how quickly they were willing to change what they'd already done. And then secondly, I've learned through this project that sometimes a museum can exist without completely understanding why. So I hope the research I've done will help Fort Calgary further articulate that answer. But as I mentioned earlier, people have been questioning Fort Calgary's existence since before it even opened. And that came from, like I said, the apathy, people calling up the curator, asking why it exists, reports of board members not being able to explain why, and then things like the federal government not being very supportive. So I'm interested to see how Fort Calgary continues to deal with this as their museum progresses. And then third, throughout my minor, I have learned that sadly, museums have a history of causing harm. I thought before I started this minor that museums were this trustworthy, authoritative figure that were unbiased and honest, but throughout my minor, I've learned that a lot of harm has been caused. And I am hopeful that things will continue to get better. You know, this isn't a new idea, but specifically in Canada, with things like the TRC and reconciliation and focusing on community engagement and accessibility, I am hopeful that the museum space will continue to get better. And then lastly, in regard to my own goals, in regard to the museum field, I'm very grateful for all the experience I've gained through my minor and the opportunities it's led me to through work, volunteer, and this practicum. So I'm not quite sure where I want to go next. I feel there's lots of aspects of the museum field I want to get experience in. So I'm looking forward to seeing where I end up. And regardless, I think I'll always have this appreciation for museums and history. And I think that'll help me with anywhere I go. So thank you for listening. And of course, thank you to Dr. Hardy for all the work you do in making this minor so interesting and engaging. I've loved it. It's really supplemented my degree so much. And of course, thank you to Fort Calgary for being my hosts. You were all so supportive and offered me such great guidance. And that's all.
Thank you, Laura. That was a wonderful overview of what you've been working on. And thank you for your kind words. Next up, and there are questions coming in for you in the chat, but we'll hold them to the end. So next up, I'd like to welcome Alicia. Alicia is a 5th year history major working or has been working with Dick Averns at the Founders Gallery at the military museums right here in Calgary. And Alicia, are you ready to share your screen?
Yeah, yay. Okay, so as Professor Hardy said, my name is Alicia, and I am in my final semester as a history student and museum and heritage study minor at the University of Calgary. The very last thing I have to complete is my practicum project. So for my practicum, I was placed at the military museums in Calgary, which I was very grateful for, as my summer internship did get canceled because of the pandemic. And there were questions if fall in-person placements were going to be able to go ahead. So I was very fortunate to work on alongside Rory Corey, who is a senior curator and director of collections at the Military Museum, and Dick Averns, who is the curatorial coordinator and acted as the art curator for the projects I was involved in at the Founders Gallery. My role in the Practicum project was to assist the curators with 2 upcoming exhibitions. Specifically, the Military Immigration Exhibition, which chronicles the story of individuals who have served in another country's military and then immigrated to Alberta. And then the Moving Targets War Film and Video Art Exhibition, which explores the recording of military conflicts over the last 100 years through video footage. Okay, so Kelsey Walker, who's going to speak next, and I both worked very closely at the Military Museum during the military immigration pre-exhibition turnaround. The aims for Kelsey and I's work on the military immigration exhibition was community outreach and building new community contacts for the military museums so they could tell these stories in the immigration exhibition. We were encouraged to build relationships with as many community associations and organizations that we could in order to gauge interest in new communities participating in the exhibition and to reach communities that the military museum had never worked with before. We accomplished this in 3 ways generally. First is we researched Albertan community associations and organizations that may have members who fit our exhibition theme, and we sent out general outreach emails to them, one of which is on screen. It's the one that's slightly higher than the other. These efforts are connected to a museological argument that always sticks with me. It's Stephen Wheel's proposal that museums should be for somebody instead of about something, which I learned at the military museum is what they're pushing for nowadays. This exhibition in particular is breaking off from what they usually do at the museum, which is focus on the Canadian military. They're trying to get more diversity and tell the story of more Calgarians. The museum was aware that there were veterans who live in Calgary but did not serve in Canada, and they wanted to create a deliberate space to tell those stories. And related to this, I also really got to see how willing the community outside the museum is to participate within the museum when offered the chance. For example, the letter on the screen is from the Calgary Hellenic organization, who I just sent a general outreach email to, and they graciously wrote a letter of support for a grant we were submitting in association with the Vietnamese Veterans Association, Immigrants Aid Association, to help fund the military exhibition. The second aspect of our work with the military immigration exhibition was to continue to liaise with community associations and to schedule meetings with them in person or through Zoom, obviously social distance when it was in person, in order to discuss their involvement at the museum and in the exhibition moving forward. It was interesting to see how a professional exhibition is built from the ground up and the timeline of how things happen. These meetings were, we reached out to people starting in August. The meetings were scheduled for October and November, and they were very preliminary briefings on the exhibition and how people could get involved. The organizations we were meeting were encouraged to pick a few stories they would want to highlight from their members, and those stories should be locked in by February. So, the image on the screen is the crest of the Calgary Vietnamese Canadian Association, which we had a meeting with. And we also had meetings with the American Legion, the Ukrainian community, the Hungarian Veterans Association, the Italian community, and Hispanic Arts, which is an organization that represents and encourages Hispanic artists in Calgary. The final aim for us within the military immigration exhibition was also assisting. My camera likes to pause on the most unattractive times, but that's okay. The final aim for us within the military immigration exhibition was to assist in creating a long list of art and artifacts that were emblematic of the stories that the community associations and the military museums wanted to highlight in their military immigration exhibition. As I have some art history experience from the University of Calgary and the classes I've taken, I focused more on the art component and Kelsey focused more on the artifact components. On the screen currently is an image that the Hungarian Veterans Association has put forward for consideration to be included in the project. It is a school photo that includes a portrait of Stephen Magus. He's on the left, kind of on the bottom, who was born in 1924 in Hungary and was an officer during the Second World War and fought during the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 before emigrating to Canada in 1957. Here are some of the other artworks that we have found during this process. On the left is trench art, specifically a carved shell casing. that would have been carved in the trenches. It includes the Hungarian crest on one side, a flower on the other, and the phrase "Memories from Russia" inscribed on the shell. On the right is a military portrait that I sourced from my grandfather, Al van der Heide, who was a Green Beret in the Royal Dutch Army in the 1950s, and who they are considering for the exhibition. Through sourcing these images, it has been enlightening to learn firsthand how museums decide whose stories to tell and what is included in an exhibition. The criteria for being included in this exhibition is pretty general. The individual has to have a good story that fits our exhibition theme, and that story could possibly be turned into an oral history and should have some art and artifacts to display. However, within our meetings, there has been a common theme of individuals who have a really good story who fits our exhibition theme, but they don't have any artifacts because they were discarded to abandon painful memories, or they were lost throughout time. And we have talked about how to fill these gaps in the exhibition, including we might have an empty suitcase that represents the loss of artifacts and pictures and the rush to move to another country. And we have also let groups know that they are welcome to create a new piece of art that can represent their experience with funding from the military museum. Overall, Kelsey and I have been very hands-on for this exhibition specifically, created a lot of spreadsheets, and I'm looking forward to May when we can hopefully go to the museum and see our work as a tangible thing that people will be able to see and connect with. Apart from the military immigration exhibition, I also helped on an exhibition entitled Moving Targets, War Film and Video Art. The show covers a wide historical breadth as it includes news broadcasts from the 1940s as pictured on the left, and modern day music videos created by individuals deployed in contemporary conflicts as seen on the right. Sourcing video footage has proven to be very different from sourcing art, as all of my outreach was contacting production companies and sources remotely. And there are various copyright considerations for both the audio and the video. Sometimes they own the rights to the video, but not the audio, or vice versa. And there's availability concerns and licensing fees, which vary from different production companies to be considered. Okay, we were encouraged to touch upon how COVID-19 has affected the museums we worked in. For our practicum placements, we obviously had to follow public health protocols such as mask wearing when we did go on site, working from home as much as we could, and social distancing when we were on site. But the pandemic has also had an effect on the exhibitions we specifically worked on in the military museums. In the wake of new restrictions, Moving Targets, one of the exhibitions I worked on, has been postponed and will not go ahead in January 2021 as planned. Instead, the current exhibition that's in the Founders Galleries, which is called Untold Stories, they never talked about it, is getting a longer run. Currently, the military immigration exhibition will go on as planned. However, it is less likely for us to be able to for our community contacts to come into the museum and see what we have to offer and decide their participation going forward and continue the pre-exhibition planning. And also many community associations were closed even in August when we first started reaching out. So we did not get as many responses as we sent out, but the responses we have received have been very supportive. Okay, I feel like I talked really fast. I'm sorry about that. In summation, my placement at the military museums allowed me to gain invaluable experience in a professional museum environment. I learned how museums can effectively reach their surrounding communities, how an exhibition's execution is planned and carried through, and how museums source both art and media. I hope next semester students have the same opportunity that I did while being safe and are able to broaden their understanding of museum work through the Practicum program. And I want to thank Dick Averns and Rory Corey for having us, and Michelle Hardy for putting it all together and making it happen. So
you, Alicia. That was really thorough, and I have been nudged by Dick that I did omit to say that you were also working with Rory Corey. So Rory, big shout out. Thank you. We have sent so many students to the Military Museum over the years, and those students always have a really fabulous experience. So thank you for this group, and thank you for the past and likely in the future. We are always super appreciative of everything that you do. Thank you, Alicia. That was wonderful. And our final speaker is Kelsey Walker, who is doing a double major in political science and history. Of course, she's also doing the minor in museum and heritage studies, as all three students are. And she has also been working with Rory Corey and Dick Averns at the Military Museum. So Kelsey, if you're ready to share your screen.
Yeah, let's see if this works. So thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to mention that I am in my 5th and final year, so I am going to be graduating in June. For my presentation, I'm going to take a little bit of a different format, as I want to do it almost a bit more lecture style while interjecting the experiences that I had with the military museums. So just to introduce myself and the project, I, like Alicia, worked with the military museums this semester under the supervision of their senior curator and director of collections, Rory Corey, and their curatorial coordinator, Dick Averns, to help out with the initial stages of their 2021 military immigration exhibition, which seeks to portray a variety of military participation from a variety of communities outside of the conventional narrative of Canadian or Allied participation. Mainly acting in a research position, I was primarily responsible for acting as a community liaison, contacting various local communities and associations. I set up and attended various meetings, and I also got a little bit of experience writing exhibition biographies. I also did gain some experience in other areas of the museums, such as their education department, through participating in numerous events and helping develop educational content for some of those events. So for myself, military history has always been one of my research interests and a little bit more of a passion for me in my degree, as it's not my major focus. So I knew that when getting the choice to do my museum and heritage studies practicum, I really wanted to do it with the military museums. They're an institute that I highly respect and have always wanted to work for. So I was fortunate enough, especially given the circumstances with COVID, to get that chance to be taken on by the museums. Throughout my personal research, something I've always been intrigued by within the heritage and museum field is the role of military museums in particular, and how they have to balance both foreign and temple, which you can see as the title of my presentation here. So in Canada and throughout my research, something I found is that our national memory works to codify a monolithic view of history and strengthen our national identity. Throughout the 20th century, there was a growing importance on the commemorative tradition, whereby memories and traumatic experiences were navigated through the creation of dominant narratives. These narratives largely act to serve the basis of many Canadian military museums and govern their interpretations of war. The difficulty of these museums thus becomes navigating both the lived experiences of lived veterans with professional museum curators, as military museums have the difficult task of balancing their function as form and temple and education with contemplation and memory. So it is this balance that I want to discuss today and contextualize with both the work I did with the military museums and the broader work that they do as an institute. So for the context of my discussion, I'm utilizing the work of James Clifford, which you can see I put a couple quotes on the slide here, who introduced the concept of museums as contact zones into modern scholarship. He argued that museums are spaces in which different cultural perspectives and experiences can be brought into the open, be shared, negotiated, and transformed, which thus makes museums a place of healing and reconciliation, but also opens them up to controversy and turns them into conflict zones. Thus, while museums are intended to inform, educate, and provoke thought, military museums have a harder time balancing these objectives due to the sensitive nature of their exhibition's content. They are sites for contesting traditional roles of power and help to define the identities of society, which is key in creating and reaffirming national memory. In particular, throughout this process, I find that veterans have become a really essential part in the narrative that shapes Canadian identity, which is one of sacrifice, honor, and nationhood, and their lived experiences gives their stories unassailable authority. This is something that I got to directly experience throughout my work with the Military Museum, as we did work with many lived veterans and their stories. So the struggle between both the educative and the memorial function of museums is what the Military Museums really works to balance. They are in the process of attempting to broaden and expand not only their portrayal of historical narratives in Canada, but also their community connections, which is the primary objective of the 2021 Military Immigration Exhibition. Now, this is no easy feat for any museum to take, but it is especially difficult to do in the context of a military museum. Military museums have to portray very sensitive and personal topics while reinforcing narratives that are accepted into the broad populace. This means that they have greater difficulties presenting counter narratives as they reinforce national myths and portray events that directly deal with human lives. What often happens in this event is many museums and their content remain stagnant. However, at the military museums, they are actively working to gradually expand Canada's understanding of wartime participation and evolve, which means they are actively working to not become stagnant. On the slide, I did include a picture of their Untold Stories exhibition, which is something Alicia had touched on. And I think that the goals and the aims of this exhibit, which really sought to tell these stories that haven't often been told and have been forgotten about, really falls in line with this idea of museums evolving while still balancing that role of educator and temple of remembrance. So on this slide, I've included the Military Museum's mission statement and values alongside the mission of the Founders Gallery, which is the gallery primarily we have been working in. According to the Military Museums Foundation on their website, military history is more than just dates and names of battles. Thus, the museum's mission is to remember, preserve, and educate. These three pillars are not only ingrained in the fabric of the museum, but they were highly evident throughout all of the experiences I received, as the remembrance and preservation of Canada's war efforts, whether that be through untangible stories and narratives or through physical and archival materials, really forms the foundation for the way that the Military Museums educates the public. As mentioned, the current exhibition on display in the Founders Gallery seeks to personalize the Canadian Second World War effort while bringing to light stories that otherwise may have been forgotten. In that same vein, the 2021 exhibition that myself and Alicia were working on is really focused on preserving the memory and stories of various community groups in Canada that otherwise may not be seen in a conventional Canadian Military Museums exhibition, which I think not only makes them incredibly unique, but incredibly worth telling. Museums play a key role in conferring the legitimacy of specific interpretations of history, and as a result, they attribute significance to particular events. Through the Military Museum's current work, which is actively seeking to diversify the narratives they present, they're helping confer legitimacy to certain histories that may not dominate narratives of Canadian history, but nonetheless are integral to Canadian society in 2020 in both our composition and the values that form our nation. Thus, the Military Museums, through its work, has been able to inform, educate, and provoke thought through its broadening of the conventional narratives of Canadian military history. Throughout my time with the Military Museums, I had the privilege of attending various meetings between the museum and local community groups, which is something Alicia had touched on. Not only were these meetings incredibly interesting and amazing to be a part of, but they were also quite emotional as we got to hear from living veterans and their personal military accounts. They caused me to reflect on how we interpret Canadian war efforts and in turn how we treat the stories of our personal veterans, which I will now briefly discuss. So I'm going to take a quick section to just discuss the soldier and the role of sacrifice in national memories in both the Canadian context and other contexts. So throughout these meetings, what struck me was the sensitive nature of telling war stories. Many of the groups that we met with, including Hispanic Arts, the Hungarian community, the Ukrainian community, and the American Legion, expressed the difficulty in not only acquiring artifacts, due to many of their members either having to flee from their home country with very little possessions or due to wanting to forget their wartime sacrifice, but also the difficulty in acquiring stories. This theme of sensitivity struck a chord with me, as my only exposure to the acquisition of war stories prior has been in the Canadian context in terms of Allied participation, particularly throughout the First and Second World War. So it's been interesting to see how this theme acts as a common unifier within a variety of ethnic groups over a variety of conflicts over a variety of periods. Just briefly to mention the two pictures that I have on the slide here, just for context. I do have a picture of the three soldiers, which is located in the Washington, D.C. monument. It's just one part of three of their Vietnam War Memorial. And then I have it contrasted beside Mother Canada, which is, of course, as part of Canada's National Vimy Memorial in France. I just wanted to kind of put these up because I really think that while they are, of course, on different conflicts, commemorating different soldiers, I think it really does show this difference in commemoration that we have here in Canada of our soldiers and how they've been remembered, as opposed to that of the United States. It's a lot less personal here. It's a lot more religious, a lot more grand, and more sacred, which is something that has definitely fueled our national memory here as that sanctity of war becomes tied with the experiences of soldiers, which not every nation has. So perhaps coming from a place of privilege, I've always viewed Canadian wartime sacrifices as the utmost sacrifice an individual has made throughout our history, one embedded in patriotic stoicism and one that deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and respected. However, many of the communities we have talked to throughout our experience do not see their wartime participation in this way. While this is due to a variety of factors, it ultimately seemed to come back to the issue of being forced to fight in a war that one did not believe in. Thus, for many of these groups, remembrance is more challenging and nuanced than it is here in Canada, as they have to reconcile the sacrifices made by their individual members with the broader historical and social conditions in their region. There are two stories that really struck me in particular that I got the chance to have exposure to, which I'm going to briefly discuss, and those are both the Calgary Vietnamese community and the American Legion. So meeting with the Vietnamese community was particularly unique. In the case of the South Vietnamese, they expressed to us that many of them fled their home country and left behind all tokens of war. What became interesting to me, however, is while they left behind the tangible elements of war, they took with them the accurate narrative of war to Canada and to their families. They shared with us that at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, following an individual's discharge from the army, they were immediately sent to re-education camps, whereby they were taught the Vietnamese government's narrative of war that stressed honorable sacrifice. While this is not surprising, as many countries do tend to justify their war effort on the basis of sacrifice, it was surprising to see this directly taught, not cultivated over decades of myth-making, which I find is more of the tendency and the trend in Canada. For the Vietnamese community, those who fled the country preserved the accurate portrayal of war, as they were not indoctrinated with a new narrative that sought to function as an extension of the state. Throughout our meetings, various veterans continually referred to their participation in the war as being a loss, and the pains associated with that, as they had to spend their whole life telling their families that they were losers. And as a result, they have never viewed their story as worth telling. They expressed sentiments concerning fears of being forgotten due to their stories not being told in both Canada and in Vietnam. So to me, the Vietnamese community truly embodies the purpose of the exhibition that the Military Museums is working on, as it seeks to tell the stories that Canadians do not hear and portray the harsh and sensitive realities of conflict outside of the narratives of Canada. So switching tone a little bit, comparatively, what struck me with the American Legion was how many of their members had to flee to Canada following the Vietnam War due to their poor treatment and reception from American society. While American social culture does tend to both elevate and venerate their soldiers, their treatment of Vietnam veterans has always been a fascination to me, because I know it has not been particularly well. While the Vietnam War has not favored well in the national memory of America and has often been disregarded, what continues to shock me is their treatment of lived veterans. Regardless of perceptions of war and whether or not militaristic conflict can be justified, veterans in America tend to be individual people who voluntarily act out of their desire to help the nation. So to vilify them on the grounds of disagreeing with government policy is a distortion of fact and something we have never had to confront too seriously in Canada. While war efforts have been reinterpreted here, particularly World War II, it has never been to the detriment of the sanctity of the soldier, which is crucial to our national memory. Here, it would be monstrous to demonize war veterans, but following the Vietnam War in America, it was widely accepted. I personally cannot fathom being away from your family to fight a war that you feel like is helping out your nation, only to return home and have your society turn its back on you to the point where you have to leave your country, uproot your family, and move to a different one. So while this is a theme I was aware of and have had some exposure to in previous studies, I've never had firsthand experience with it. So it really caused me to reflect on the differences between Canada's military culture and remembrance and that of other countries. And it also really forced me to see the importance of what the Military Museums is doing here with their exhibition. While these two groups merely highlight only a glimpse of the stories that I had the privilege of hearing, they particularly stood out to me as they not only challenged some of my own assumptions of the education of contentious military histories, but they also caused me to reflect on just how differently other countries reconcile their historical narratives with their national identities than we do in Canada, a theme which is incredibly interesting and will be explored on in the upcoming exhibition. So while I could go on and talk all day, and I would if given the chance, given the sake of time, I must end here. So I just want to end off by, of course, extending my thanks to Dr. Hardy. Your help throughout the past few years of my undergrad career has been some of the most useful help I have received, incredibly useful for my degree, incredibly useful for my professional experience. And of course, you helping me find this placement with the Military Museums was well appreciated. And I want to conclude by expressing my gratitude to the Military Museums. They've always been an institute that I really wanted to work with, and they surpassed all of my expectations. Every single member of their staff and volunteer team who I got the pleasure to work with was not incredibly kind to me, but also holds extensive knowledge and passion in their work, which is incredibly inspiring for me, someone who is about to graduate and go into the field. Getting to play an active role in educating the public on stories and lives that deserve remembrance is something I never thought I would get the opportunity to do. And if my work at the Military Museums helped to make even one veteran feel as though they're being remembered, I would have accomplished more than I could have ever hoped to during this practicum. Of course, I could not conclude without thanking Rory, Corey, and Dick Averns, who I know are here today, so that's perfect because I can thank you guys personally. Upon first meeting, I was struck by their high degree of professionalism, knowledge in the field, passion for museology and military history, and their excitement and willingness to take on student help. This was a huge surprise to me, as it's rare to see this level of dedication, and immediately became evident how incredible it would be to get to work with two men of their stature. Their kindness made doing this practicum a true pleasure, and I just want to thank you guys personally for the opportunity. Not only were the two of you highly professional, but you allowed me to play an active role in the military museums, which made me feel like less of a student intern and more of a valued member of your team. Ultimately, the work I gained from the military museum was invaluable, as it provided me with not only marketable skills on my CV, but also with a unique opportunity to play a role in creating a public exhibition on a very important and meaningful topic to Canadians, which gave me an experience I never thought I would have received during my undergraduate career, and one in which I am incredibly grateful to have received.
Thank you, Kelsey. That was amazing. That was a really wonderful, not just what I did in my practicum, but really a reflection and a critical reflection. So well done. Thank you for that. And at this point, I would like to open up the floor for questions, but we have a few in the chat. So let's start there. And the first is a question for Laura. And actually, I think probably all three of you can speak to this. Laura, could you elaborate on your observation about museums causing harm? Was this a staff perception, a public perception, your perception? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely my own perception that I've gained from the classes in my minor. Like I said, I came into my minor just knowing that I enjoyed going to museums, but I'd never known how to think about them critically or known about any of its past, really. I just knew I enjoyed going to them. So whether it was learning about how difficult repatriation is, or, you know, like in my first Museum Studies 201 class, we talked about how freak shows could be considered a type museum that exploited people with disabilities, just dominating narratives, lack of representation. And then even today, like the big scandal with the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, like this is an ongoing issue of representation and ignoring different communities, overstepping boundaries. And this is just all things that I didn't know before my minor, and I'm glad I do now. And I think when I go to museums, I have a much more critical eye when I do anything in them. So I'm sure as I continue to work in the field, it'll become more prominent, but for now, it's mostly just been the straight discussions in class that I've learned about this harm.
Are you optimistic, Laura? Do you see a positive role for museums?
I do. I think that a lot of them are making the shift right now to put more emphasis on communities constructing their own narrative, finding ways to make repatriation work. I know it's very complex. It's not as easy as just giving artifacts back. But I think that as these conversations, especially in class, are happening, I think it's going to be a slow process, but I do have hope. And I think as more museums start to change their exhibits and narratives, that it will only get better. I can't see it getting worse from this point. I think it's pretty well known that these issues exist. So I am hopeful.
Thank you for that. A question for Alicia about your point about negotiating copyright and licensing for video art. Can you give an example of where this was difficult or not possible? And conversely, where was access smooth and easy?
Yeah, so I reached out to multiple different people who had footage that we were excited to use in the exhibition. One that was a bit more difficult is Dick had found the video on YouTube, so I found the company who made it. I emailed them and asked if there was any chance we could screen it, and they said that they actually didn't own all of the copyright to the images used, they just owned all the audio, so he was willing to cut out some of the pictures, but that would take a little bit more negotiating. Also, I reached out to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City for Martha Rossler video in their collections, and they did not want to give us access to it. without providing much of a reason. So I contacted Martha Rossler's gallery representation in New York City, and they couldn't give me access to that particular video as well because it was produced specifically by the MoMA. For an example of when it was smoother and easier, I did get a really quick response from British Paith, which is an archival site in the UK, and they were ready to license everything. They gave me quotes, but their rates were very expensive. So yeah. Also easy was using the Canadian Army newsreels. They're all available to look at on YouTube, so you can go find it, and then we will figure out how to license it a bit later.
Thank you. And I'm going to mash up two questions here again for Laura. Laura, could you say a bit more about the book project, sort of what it is and where it's going? And also question from Rory about the specifics of any archaeological finds. And can you share any of the highlights of those? Because I'm not sure that fits into your project.
Yeah, I'll start with the one from Rory. It was actually one of the rabbit holes I fell down at some point. It actually was really interesting. It was mostly conducted, like the excavations were conducted by I think the Alberta Glenbow Institute, maybe it's the other way around. And then also the U of C archaeology students. And they found a ton of stuff in their excavations, which they were not expecting. And that actually pushed the project back about a year, I think, because they just assumed that since the site had been lost and buried for so long that they weren't going to find anything that great. But they were very wrong, and it was a very successful dig for them. So I think they found into like the thousands of artifacts, and they had volunteers, even like kids were allowed to come join in the dig and find stuff. So I wasn't able to find any records from UC just because the archives were closed, but I do know they have records of that excavation. So hopefully if that is relevant to the book, someone can go look at that. But it was pretty interesting. Yeah, it wasn't exactly tied to the main goal of the project, but it definitely was relevant as it was a big part of the timeline of opening the museum because it did make things longer and they found a lot more than they thought. And then for the book itself, honestly, I can't speak too much about what it's going to be about in the end. I was just given my research scope, so what the history of the Interpretive Center was and any ties that the RCMP had to their Interpretive Center, beyond just having their history represented in. And I know it's going to start to be written in 2021, but the person writing it is not even going to start looking at my research until January, I think. So, and mine is just the baseline research. And since the archives were closed, there still is more research to be done. So I don't even think there is a set title or like argument or baseline narrative yet. I think that'll depend on what supporting material they can find in addition to mine.
Thank you, Laura. And I think we probably have time for one last question. And Rory has typed in here for Alicia and Kelsey, sorry. You mentioned how military immigration exhibit relates to museological theory. Can you, and I have to say that makes me so happy, all those citations. Can you make recommendations on how we should be interacting with the communities we're talking to in an effort to make the exhibit more effective and impactful and to be more in line with current museological theory? Kelsey, we haven't heard from you. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I would say with current museum practices, gone are the days of passive portrayals of people in exhibitions. And it really is about that active, personal, narrative-driven portrayal of individuals. So I would say in terms of what can be done, really already has been done through the work that you guys are doing, but really ensuring that stories are told by communities and for communities. I think that's going to be the most important thing with this exhibition. And that's going to ensure that, we aren't just portraying individuals as passive actors in history and rather as individual active agents in their own history. So just really stressing that ability for stories to tell, for individuals to tell their own stories.
Alicia?
Yeah, I also wanted to add on to that. There's Nina Simon did an amazing talk called Opening Up the Museum, where she talks about how museum artifacts are shared cultural objects that can bring together people who otherwise wouldn't be able to come together. And I think what's amazing about this exhibition is it's taking like a shared cultural experience, which is military service and then emigrating to Alberta, and letting communities that served on the other side of the world kind of come together, and kind of just speak to how Laura said about museums being harmful, which is definitely true, but we also talked to community associations about doing event days, COVID permitting, letting them do art days or reading corners where they could read poetry from their art or prose. And we also talked about the idea of doing like group sessions where people can come together and try and heal from the trauma that is their military experience. So I think that's really great.
Thank you both. And there are more questions coming in, but I'm mindful of the time. So maybe what we'll do is, if the three speakers have a few more minutes, we can keep addressing some of these questions. But if people have to log off, certainly respect that. And I'll just jump in here and say again, thank you so much to Rory and Dick at the military museums. Thank you to everyone at Fort Calgary. Again, we've worked with both institutions many times over the years, and we're so grateful of the tremendous opportunities that they present to our students. We have 4 students coming up next year, maybe sending you someone, Rory, maybe. Depends on their interests, so I'll be in touch. But you know, again, we really appreciate the broad support that we have for the students and for the program across the community. So thank you. So if we have a few more minutes with the speakers, and great compliments coming into all 3 of you. There was another question from Paul Brown about added impetus to make archival material available online because of the long-term effects of distancing. Well, yeah. Challenging question, Paul, and I hadn't really realized until you raised the point that, of course, archives are closed. Of course, it's affecting students and other people's research. I can't speak for what the Glenbow Archives at the University of Calgary is doing. I know that they're closed. I know that archivists are working at home, but of course they don't have access to files either. So if anybody else has input on what's going on, maybe I can put Rory or Dick on the spot. Can you say anything about what's happening at TMM? I know the archivists are working, but can people come in and use those facilities?
Unfortunately, the museum is going to be locked down pretty hard from December 13th to January 11th. I'm not really sure, Dick, if you know if Jason's going to be accessible via email during that time, but for in-person visits, it's just not going to be possible for the next month.
Yeah.
So what I can add is that I'm not sure whether Jason will have regular access, but in terms of the question about online access, I do know that in the instance of a movie production, which is the documentary Deployed, produced by Mike Vernon, that premiered at the museum recently, and that's a feature-length documentary. He has worked to break down all the individual reservist soldiers that were deployed overseas and gave interviews for the raw material for making the feature-length documentary. He has made all of those available online. And so I can't say, Paul, great question, whether or not that was specifically in response to COVID. I'm not sure at what point, Rory might know at which point all those individual interviews were made available online through the Military Museum's website. But I think that a bigger answer would be to Paul's question in terms of the respective archives at the Military Museum. And I need to put in the caveat that as my job at Founders Gallery, we don't have a specific archive or collection. So I'm not trying to speak for these other individuals, but in the instance of the museums that are staffed or managed by serving officers, so or military personnel, so that would be the Princess Patricia's and the Lord Strathcona, they've been subject to more recently being advised or put in let me stop falling over my words here. They've been subject to contact breaker, circuit breaker shutdowns, and early on in the pandemic, they had strict orders to not be going in if they didn't have to, and we had troops and reservists that were stood up for active duty in relation to COVID, and potentially for service in other areas like forest fires, floods, and things like that. So when you've got museums and archives that are being run by serving personnel that are subject to other military regulations, then that makes it very difficult. And also, a lot of the archives and collections have volunteers who perhaps are seniors and have been keeping away from the museum. We've had certain sections of the museum that would normally be staffed by volunteers who, for again, perhaps because of age or veterans have other health conditions, and so we've actually overall, I would say, with the exceptions of being able to work with having fresh interns come in as part of the placements that we're hearing from today, the bottom line is we've actually had less staff. I would imagine, because again, I'm not speaking for them, but Rory can confirm this, but I think we've actually had less personnel available to be able to work with collections and archives, plus the moving targets of trying to put shows up and take shows down during COVID, creating so much uncertainty. So.
Thank you, Dick. And thank you for the question, Paul. In the last maybe minute, I know there's a few students that have joined us. I wondered if any of the students had a question about the current Practicum students' experiences. Too shy. Well, thank you all. Thank you for the questions, and thank you for your responses. And thank you to our 3 brand new minted Practicum students. You've done a fantastic job under, incredible situations. And I want to congratulate you and thank all of the hosts again.